There are many cases where people have not been able to account for lost time, and in some cases have found themselves in a completely different location from where they started out. The following are 5 cases where people had inexplicably lost time amidst glowing lights. The disappearing corporal. In April 1977, a small unit of army conscripts was sent on a 2-day training exercise in the inhospitable terrain above the small town of Putra in Chile. The group of inexperienced young troops was led by Corporal Armando Valdez. Their mission was to camp out and train in the harsh environment of the windswept plateau at Pampa La Scuma, situated at an altitude of 12,000 feet. On the night of April the 24th, the group set up camp. At approximately 3:50 a.m, the soldier on duty that night, a recruit named Pedro Rosales, observed something highly abnormal. He spotted what appeared to be 2 hazy violet-coloured lights descending from the mountains and heading in the direction of the camp. As the lights approached, the ground below was suffused in an eerie glow. Unsure whether the lights were flares being utilised in a simulated enemy attack, Corporal Valdez quickly sprang into action. He ordered some of the men to conceal the campfire with blankets to avoid detection. Simultaneously, he instructed the other soldiers to prepare their weapons for a potential threat. By this time, the 2 fuzzy lights had merged into one large, nebulous glow situated on a hillside a few hundred yards away from the camp. The glow remained motionless for several long minutes. Despite the frightened protests of the inexperienced chargers, Valdez was determined to investigate the disturbance. He commanded the nervous young men to keep their guns trained on him while he headed off alone into the inky darkness towards the mysterious violet illumination. As the soldiers huddled behind a nearby wall with weapons at the ready, Valdez muttered a brief prayer asking God for protection. Then he disappeared into the blackness of the night, moving towards the abnormal glowing presence. Mere seconds after the intrepid corporal had left, the camp was plunged into silence as the ethereal glow abruptly vanished. Stunned, the frightened young conscripts waited anxiously for Valdez to return. Roughly 50 minutes later, the corporal reappeared from the same direction in which he had departed earlier. However, it was immediately apparent to the soldiers that something was terribly wrong. Valdez seemed to be in a trance-like state, wandering slowly towards them, as if sleepwalking. When he finally reached the campsite, he collapsed to the ground in a semi-conscious state. His behaviour and demeanour were highly alarming and abnormal. The concerned conscripts cared for their stricken leader as best they could, waiting anxiously for dawn so they could properly assess the situation. When daylight arrived, the men made several troubling discoveries about Valdez following his bizarre experience. Although they had just witnessed him shaving his face just hours earlier, he now sported several days' growth of facial hair. Additionally, his wristwatch had stopped at approximately 4:30 a.m. around the time he returned to camp. However, the manual date function on the watch, which had to be rotated forward 1 day at a time, inexplicably read April the 30th, 5 days ahead of the current date. Furthermore, when Valdez finally regained consciousness, he appeared to be suffering from massive memory loss and lacked proper coordination of his faculties. Later, he would describe the missing minutes or hours during which he had encountered the glow as a void in his mind. To this day, Chilean army officials have no reasonable explanation for what transpired during the bizarre events of that April night in 1977. Although they have confirmed that the incident did indeed occur, the details remain a perplexing mystery. One thing is certain, Corporal Valdez experienced a traumatic ordeal and was never the same again following his rendezvous with the inexplicable, nocturnal, glowing presence high atop the windswept plateau. Illuminating landscape. On a late September night in 1973, a 21-year-old man known only as Paul was driving through the English village of Little Horton in the Midlands region. As he passed the local church, he checked his watch and noted that the time was approximately 2 a.m. However, shortly after observing the clock, Paul experienced an unexplained loss of time and awareness that continued for several hours. When he regained cognitive function, Paul found himself wandering on foot near the village of Bromham, located 60 miles from where his drive had originated. Although it was not raining at the present moment, his clothing was dripping wet. Paul's vehicle was nowhere to be seen and exhibited no obvious signs of injury. Furthermore, he was shocked to observe daylight illuminating the landscape. The night had somehow become morning, while Paul retained no memory of the intervening hours. Understandably confused and disoriented, Paul located a friend who lived nearby in Bromham and related the peculiar tale of his lost time experience. His friend agreed to drive him along the A428 highway, retracing Paul's route back towards Little Houghton. Approximately 5 miles from Bromham, near the village of Turvey, they discovered Paul's car sitting in the middle of a muddy field. Strangely, there were no tyre marks in the soil leading from the closed gate to the vehicle's location. The car was locked, with Paul's keys still in his pocket, and seemed completely undamaged. Due to the thick mud caused by heavy rains during the night, Paul's car could not be driven from the field. A local farmer had to tow it out using a tractor. 2 years after his bizarre experience, Paul experienced a sudden flashback to additional details of that night. He now recalled driving away from Little Houghton and observing a nebulous white glow approaching his windshield prior to blacking out. The next thing Paul remembered was regaining awareness 5 hours later as he wandered near Bromham, with no memory of what had transpired in the interim. The details of Paul's experience remain a mystery. However, it seems clear that he lost several hours of time that night, somehow travelling 60 miles on foot through the rain without retaining any memory of the journey. The discovery of his car, undamaged yet transported to the middle of a muddy field with all doors locked, also presents a puzzle with no rational explanation. The Vanishing Worker. In 1995, a security guard was working the overnight shift at a small factory in Florida. After completing his rounds, he settled in to monitor the video feeds from the facility's security cameras. On one screen, he observed one of his factory workers walking towards the building's rear entrance and loading dock. As the guard watched the worker approach the door, a strange, fuzzy white glow suddenly appeared, enveloping the area where the man was standing. Simultaneously, electromagnetic interference temporarily disrupted the quality of the video feed on the monitor. The nebulous glow persisted for several seconds before vanishing just abruptly as it had materialized. When the haze cleared, the factory worker had completely disappeared. Subsequent frame-by-frame analysis of the security footage clearly depicts the man's instantaneous dematerialization upon being inundated by the luminous fog. Alarmed by what he'd witnessed, the security guard rushed to the loading dock to investigate and search for the now missing worker. However, his efforts to locate the man anywhere in the vicinities were futile. Stymied and deeply confused, he returned to the monitoring station. For nearly 2 hours, the guard kept a vigilant watch over the security screens. Then, at roughly an hour and 50 minutes after the original incident, the guard observed another extraordinary sight. All of the factory lights blacked out momentarily as a glowing fog reappeared in the loading dock. Within a fraction of a second, the vanished worker could be glimpsed once again inside the haze as it dissipated rapidly. The stunned man had suddenly reappeared, now in a state of severe distress. He was on all fours and looked visibly ill. As the worker staggered around in a disoriented manner, the shocked security guard hurried to assist him. Unfortunately, the worker had no recollection whatsoever of his bizarre 2-hour ordeal. One moment he'd been walking towards the building, and the next he found himself materializing in the loading dock, nauseous and trembling with anxiety. The episode had produced a gaping hole in his memory. Understandably rattled by his experience, the worker went home and reported being too unwell to return to work the following day. In fact, he never set foot in the factory again following his inexplicable vanishing and reappearance. In-depth examination of the security footage by scientists and computer analysts verified that the tape had not been altered or manipulated in any way. However, no rational explanation for the events depicted has ever been put forth. A luminous encounter. One night in September 1995, 39-year-old business advisor Mark Henschel was riding his motorcycle alone down a darkened rural stretch of Castle Lane in County Durham, England. Although the winding country road was typically deserted at that late hour, Mark's evening was interrupted around 11:30 p.m. by a peculiar sight. Checking his mirrors, Mark noticed two glowing lights behind him in the distance. Assuming the illumination came from the headlamps of another vehicle, he monitored the lights' movement in his rear view as they drew steadily closer. After approximately 30 seconds, Mark observed a Jaguar automobile approaching him from behind in the left lane, preparing to overtake his motorcycle. He courteously pulled over to allow the faster car to pass unimpeded. However, as the Jaguar steered around Mark's bike, an intensely bright, hazy violet glow enveloped both vehicles without warning. The fog-like mass exuded an eerie pinkish hue at its edges, suggestive of odd ultraviolet radiation. In that same instant, Mark's motorcycle abruptly lost all engine power. Though the engine had cut out entirely, the bike continued gliding up the inclined road as if compelled by an unseen force. The driver of the Jaguar reported an identical experience, with his car's motor dying but the vehicle continuing forward against gravity. Understandably shaken by the occurrence, Mark brought his motorcycle safely to a stop on the curb once the glowing fog had dissipated. The Jaguar driver also pulled over nearby. Inspecting his bike, Mark felt the formerly cool metal of the vehicle now radiating an alarming amount of heat. The leather jacket he was wearing seemed to be steaming, as if freshly removed from a dryer. Although it was raining earlier in the evening, prompting Mark to don a raincoat at the onset of his ride, his outerwear was now bone dry. Puzzled, Mark approached the driver of the Jaguar to confer about their shared unexplainable experience. The man confirmed that his car's roof was also inexplicably hot to the touch after their luminous encounter. By Mark's estimation, the total bizarre incident spanned no more than 10 minutes from his initial observation of the two trailing lights to the dissipation of the violet fog. However, upon arriving home, he was astonished to note a sizable discrepancy in the actual time elapsed. Somehow Mark had lost approximately 25 minutes during the uncanny event, as evidenced by the lack of continuity between the time he'd left home and the time he returned. Although unable to account for the missing period, he developed an acute sunburn-like rash on one side of his face and his thighs within a day of the occurrence. To this day, Mark remains at a loss to explain the reality of what transpired during his drive that night. His motorcycle and body had undeniably been exposed to some potent energy source, which interfered with his perception of time. Yet no comprehensible cause can account for the phenomenon he encountered on that empty country road. While maintaining a pragmatic perspective, Mark feels certain he brushed against the boundaries of our conventional reality that evening. Somewhere along that darkened byway, a doorway to the unknown briefly cracked open to engulf him in its impenetrable mystery.